Thanks. Hi, this is going to be a lot of fun because I've learned an awful lot the last day and a half, and then I got to hear Patrick right now, and I think we ought to focus on outcomes. Productivity will follow, and so that'll be a wonderful debate that we can have. So let me tell you a little bit about my perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and how I got the job I just got, and I'll mention a bit the job, not the job I just got, but the one I had before this, which was running performance and personnel management at the US Office of Management and Budget. And so basically, I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about what I'm trying to do now, but I want to really take you through our experience at the Office of Management and Budget, what my job was, why I did it, how we did it, what's working, what's not working, what we think the challenges are ahead, because I think it's very much close to whether you're sitting here as a government official or you're an academic. I think there's areas we can work together across countries. So my job at the US Office of Management and Budget, I was the Associate Director for Performance and Personnel Management. So you have the President, you have the Director of the Office of Management and Budget who reports to the President and really has the manpower to make sure agencies are implementing according to the President's policies within budget, things like that. You have a Deputy Director for Management, and then there are four of us: the head of IT, the head of procurement, the head of finance, the chief financial officer, and then myself, who was the associate director for performance and personnel management, setting policy, but also moving implementation of changes across the whole federal government. Now, how did I get that job? I actually wrote a book, and they hired me because I wrote a book. Basically, right before the Bush administration, I had headed up something at the Kennedy School called the Executive Session on Public Sector Performance Management, where we brought together leading thinkers from the public and private sector on how you use goals and measures to improve outcomes and productivity, et cetera. And we brought folks who'd done this at the federal, state, and local level from the public and private sector, and we created what was called the Open Memorandum for New Executives on public sector performance management. That document I can still make available. It's actually a wonderful, short, sweet document. And we put it out, and in fact, the Bush administration folks paid a little bit of attention to it. They made some implementation decisions that I don't think worked too well, but they tried to get agencies to manage with goals and measures. There was a law that had passed in 1993 on this, requiring all federal agencies to do strategic plans with long-term goals, annual plans with annual goals, and annual performance reports. And then the Bush administration decided to look at the program level and have budget examiners review programs, 1,000 programs, and grade them on their adoption of specific practices. So because I had led that executive session, the IBM Center for the Business of Government actually called me a year before the end of the Bush administration and said, do you want to do the same thing for the next administration, whoever it is? So we had no idea if it was going to be a Democrat or Republican. We didn't even at the time know who was going to run for office. And I take a long time to write. So, we're getting into the, summer months, et cetera, and I'm working on this document, and I start to have some drafts. And happily along came a candidate named Barack Obama, whose staff found out I was working on this and took a look at the draft. And so it started to get, some of the recommendations started to get into the campaign discussions of the person who became the president-elect. The Republican side didn't reach out to me, but so there you have it, and we've got this, I'm working on this, and the recommendations, I get these recommendations out, and they get out at the end of October. I work to deadline, I have to be honest. The election's in November, I get it out right before the election, and it's the set of recommendations for the next administration. And then the transition team for Obama actually looked at those recommendations and started to put them into their transition documents. And then the deputy director for management got named the chief performance officer, one of my recommendations, And he then looked around for people to implement on that, and I'd written a set of recommendations, so I got the job that way. What was great was that I then had a blueprint for action. And that's really good because I could sort of work to it. I can also share it with you because some of it may be relevant to what you guys are working on. But what was also interesting was I got this job, late September was when I actually finally got appointed because it took that long for that deputy director to get confirmed by our Senate. So here it was, I'm 9 months into a new administration, and I've done a set of recommendations. And now the president's been working for 9 months full speed ahead. The first 100 days has already passed, right? We always talk about the first 100 days. How do I move forward with these recommendations? So anyway, that's how I got the job. That's when I came into the job, and some of the things I had to figure out how to get things done. When I come in 9 months into a new administration, or 10 months, where things really are already happening. And I've got this set of recommendations. Now, what are my recommendations? My recommendations are based on having looked at what the federal government in the US was doing, but also what the United Kingdom and Tony Blair had done with the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. Also what New Zealand had done with output agreements with its ministers. And the contracts that they had done, the 3-year contracts. I don't know where they are now. Some of you from New Zealand can tell me where you are now. I also looked at what happened in New York City. New York City policing, where the police commissioner, a man named Bill Bratton, had created the CompStat program. How many of you know about CompStat? Okay, a handful of people. So CompStat was very simply, Bill Bratton was the police commissioner. He came into New York City and he basically said, we need to have we're going to bring the crime rate down 25% in 3 years. We're going to bring the crime rate down 25% in 3 years. He says he's going to do this. And basically his first question to his staff is, okay, what are the crime statistics? Right? And do you think they had the crime statistics? Well, in fact, what they had was response times that they were getting on a regular basis. They had the crime statistics, but they were 9 months old. Because the local government, New York City, was required to provide to the state in order to get the federal grants. I know this is going to sound familiar to you. They were required to provide crime statistics every quarter. But they were not due until 6 months after the close of the quarter because, you can't give us too much of a reporting burden. So it turned out that's the only crime data that the city had also, 9 months old. And Bratton looked at it and said, I can't manage with this. I need weekly crime statistics. So he insisted that he get crime statistics from every precinct once a week. And he literally made them on Friday evenings, drive in, and some of you, I'm looking around, some of you will recognize this, some of you won't. They had to bring in floppy disks. It was a Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheet before Excel and all the things that have happened since then. And they had to drive into New York City traffic and bring it to headquarters, which then Bill Bratton had what he called CompStat sessions, computerized statistics, every 6 weeks. The precinct captain had to get up with 2 screens like this behind him or her, with a panel of inquisitors in front of them, with a bunch of folks from the precinct and the boroughs around, as well as other people from other offices like the budget office, the general counsel's office, the detective's office. They would all sit there, and this panel would ask questions. What's going on with crime in your community? If it's gone up, why is it going up? What's your plan to deal with it? If it's going down, why do you think it's going down? Is there something going on there? Did you take some action that maybe others should take because they can learn from it? So Bill Bratton put in place this CompStat system with a very clear set of outcome-focused goals, not activity-focused, not output-focused, not the number of arrests. Yes, he gathered the data on a number of arrests. Yes, they gathered the data on overtime use. They put all of that literally on a screen behind the precinct captain. And they asked questions about it. So they had goals, they had frequent measurement that was timely. it was up to date. And then they had these data-driven reviews where the head of the organization, Bratton, or two of his lieutenants were asking questions, and everybody knew Bratton was paying attention. And they made clear the precinct captain was accountable. So there was an accountable official, because before doing this, nobody knew who was actually responsible. Was it the borough chief, or was it the precinct captain who was responsible for bringing crime down? And what was really interesting, if you talk to Bratton, is he'll tell you, well, actually, when he talked to the police, they basically said, we can't be held accountable for reducing the crime rate. We don't control the crime rate. We can only influence it. We don't control the crime rate. So hold us accountable for what we can control. We can control response times. And Bratton said, no way. This is about public safety. That's our objective here. Faster response times may make sense in a lot of cases because you do care about customer service. You do care about actually public perceptions of the quality of government interaction. But in fact, sometimes if it's not that intense, a call that comes in that's not that important, you might want to say to folks, we can be there in 30 minutes, there are more pressing things, and manage expectations. So Bratton wanted the whole thing managed. He wanted the whole thing managed, but he wanted everybody to focus on the real objective here, which was reducing the crime rate. Similar things, I had seen similar things happen in multiple other places. Gary Sturgis yesterday talked about firefighting and the fact that firefighters don't really fight very many fires anymore. At the same time, we really like their distributed network and capacity across a lot of different locations. And so what's in the United States, similar to, it's not with Falk, the Danish company he mentioned, but it's what we've seen in the United States is firefighters mostly do emergency response. Why? Because they knew their objective was reducing fires and the cost of fires when they did happen. And so they started to count across the country. The National Fire Protection Association is a national organization that gets data from the local governments. And they started to look at what was causing the fires so they could figure out those root causes and focus on them. So right now, it's candle fires for building fires. For candles are the major cause of problem. And they've been able to sort of focus on those because they've got so many of the sprinkler systems. They put out model codes. Firefighters successfully put themselves almost out of business, but actually were able to change so that they're now looking at emergency response and how do we manage that better. A real success story of focusing on outcomes, having frequent measurement, and then analyzing the data, looking at the data to figure out what's working so we can do more of it, what's not working, so we can drill down to figure out why not, the root causes, and we can try different methods to address those. Let me give you one other example that went into our thinking about how we wanted to do this at the federal level. So at the federal level, you have, another story, you had a federal agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, where one regional office, this didn't start from the top, it started one regional office, this happened during the Clinton administration, 1995, the head of that regional office said, we are going to make the Charles River, that's the river that runs between Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. We're going to make it swimmable in 10 years. Now, the rowers on the river, the guys, who did the rowing competition, they basically, if they fell in the river, they'd have to get a tetanus shot. And what the head of the regional office, John DeVillers, said is, we're going to make it swimmable in 10 years. And then he turned to one of his staff people and he said, he was a lawyer, he said, you're in charge of it, you can get some other people working with you. So 3 people part-time knew it was their job to make sure the Charles River was swimmable in 10 years. Again, outcome focused. Stretch target, going from tetanus shots to swimmable in 10 years. Now, John, the regional administrator, announced that on the eve of a major international Head of the Charles Regatta, brings 250,000 people to the city. I think it's now up to almost 1 million. And so he got front page story in the paper about this. People started to pay attention. 6 months later, it was the Earth Day. in April, and so John decided he was going to give a grade to the river. Now, by giving a grade to the river, he was basically saying, on Earth Day, a recurring date, he was basically saying, hey, we're going to keep our eye on this. This wasn't just an announcement. This is something we're going to manage to. And you had the 3 staffers who were like, how are we going to manage to this? Well, the first thing, of course, that they had to do was figure out whether or not how clean the river was. But it turned out the EPA, which gave money to the state, which also worked with the local governments, similar to yours, the state gathered water quality data once every 5 years. Not very frequent, not very fresh. It would do plans, it would do watershed plans. It was actually considered a leader across the country in terms of its watershed approach. But the data was so old, they would do a plan, they'd implement the plan, they'd assess if the plan worked, et cetera. You know, it's like, wait a minute, the economy's changed. You don't even know who's flowing into the river anymore, right? So you basically, once the EPA, the region said we're going to make the Charles River swimmable, they had to go find data. The state didn't have it. The local government only had the discharge data from the permitters going into the water. And they decided, let's look at this. There's some volunteers who are out there gathering data for 37 points along the 80-mile stretch of the river. It's the best we have. Let's use it. And so they started to use it, and they would notice where a downstream site had a worse reading than an upstream site. And they'd say, we can focus our actions on that section of the river. And so they would then pick up the phone, call the state, do you know why this reading is worse, the water quality is worse? And the answer was no. So then they started to say, okay, let's call the city. They called the city, and the city said no. They said, let's pull the maps. Let's walk the pipes. So they walked the pipes, and they found an illegal hookup to the sewer system. Now, I've talked to some of you in the last few days, and I didn't tell this story before, but I had to tell that story because it links to why I think it's so important to focus on outcomes and not just productivity. Productivity is helpful, but you've got to start with outcomes. Because basically, the Environmental Protection Agency has permit writers, it has inspectors who inspect the permit holders, it has enforcement guys who follow up where you have a bad enforcement problem. And I could look at productivity on many of those things. But the fact of the matter is the problem was coming from the folks who never bothered to come in and get a permit in the first place. And unless you actually looked at the water quality data, you were not going to find those guys. Once they found those guys, they realized, illegal hookups to the sewer system are a problem. And I will mention that rowers used to complain that they would see dirty stuff coming out of these storm sewer pipes. But the EPA didn't bother to follow up because they didn't think it was a significant enough problem. But then when they realized they had this water quality problem, and it was because of an illegal hookup to the storm sewers that should have been going into the sanitary sewers. One of them was a 90-bed dormitory going into the storm sewers, untreated into the river that people were rowing on. Ick, right? But they basically realized, okay, we've got this opportunity. They used the outcome data that they were now getting once a month, and they were looking at and having data-driven discussions once a month. They used the outcome data to trigger focused follow-up questions, really complicated questions. Why? A very complicated question. Why is that happening? And they kept asking why till they found out the answer, which was illegal hookups. Once they found one, they decided to do, and Jean, excuse me, they decided to do a replication demonstration. They decided to look for others. How are we going to find out if there are other illegal hookups? But they had a data-driven discussion. A data-driven discussion, and someone said, why don't we lift the sewer cap, the covers, the manhole cover caps over the sewers on dry days when it's not raining, and see if there's water running in the storm sewers, because there shouldn't be. So wherever they found water running, they told the local governments across the state to do that. They found water running, they then went up pipe to find the sources, and they were able to improve the water quality from being swimmable 19% of the time in 1995 to being swimmable 59% of the time in 5 years later, by 2000. And so what's very interesting is you've got this robust outcome-focused goal that excites people, that the public cares about. When they have the Earth Day discussions, the newspaper writes about it, they do an event, they bring people together, and they talk about what are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? And they start to make this work. So that was some of the experience we were looking at. There's also research on the power of goals as inspirational, stretch targets as stimulating innovation and energizing people from lab experiments. So there's a lot of good experience. And then we saw what Tony Williams had done at the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. And that, that brought us to saying, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to require some basic building blocks. That was my recommendations. The president ought to set 5 goals. They ought to be priority goals. They ought to be outcome-focused goals. Not too many, because you've got to be able to focus. And we want these to be stretch targets to stimulate innovation. The head of every cabinet ought to set stretch goals, about 5. They need to measure at least quarterly. None of this once a year kind of stuff. They need to measure at least quarterly. They need to run data-driven discussions on it. They need to analyze the data and bring that into the discussions that use the analysis of the data to trigger focused follow-up questions. So that's what we mandated. We also said, remember that precinct captain thing? You've got to have goal leaders. So we really wanted to make sure that you had the equivalent of a precinct captain, someone who knew they were responsible at those data-driven reviews for saying, what's working and why? Do we want to do more of it? Do we know how to do more of it? Do we need to try and demonstrate its replicability? Or have we already done that, and so do we want to promote its adoption more broadly? What's not working, and what are we going to do about that? How do we fix that? So those data-driven discussions. Now, of course, someone had to run that meeting. So we mandated that the number 2 person in the department had to run the meeting. We have a more political structure than you do. I was a political appointee. The head of a cabinet is a political appointee, but not a member of Congress. The number 2 is a political appointee, and then we have heads of programs, major programs that can also be political appointees. So we mandated you need to set goals, measure performance, run regular data-driven reviews, et cetera. So if you take a look, this is a live website right here. And so on performance improvement, you basically, I don't know if I can figure this one out. Yeah. You had to set clear goals, measure and analyze them, and run data-driven reviews. Now, I will admit, remember I told you I came in the 9th month of the first administration. So I come in, and I had recommended that the president set 5 goals that would be priority goals. And in those, as soon as I got that job, day 1, I think even if it hadn't been 9 months in, day 1 I realized, wow, president's up for re-election in 4 years. No way you want to put a target on his back. Because as you all well know, if you set stretch targets, you're not likely to meet all of your targets. So, and yet in a political system, that can be highly controversial politically. So I realized, President already has stretch targets. He's trying to stabilize the economy. He's trying to get the Affordable Care Act and get a much better healthcare system in the United States. He's trying to deal with, at the time, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. And to get us out of Iraq and to deal with the genuine problem, which is terrorism, and to manage the reduction of terrorism. So he was already doing that. I wasn't about to come in the beginning of October and say, oh, by the way, President, you need to do this. So I had to set up a system where we could get the cabinet folks to do this at the same time that the president was intensely focused on stabilizing the economy and also beginning to realize that the civility of the conversation, the debate, between the president and Congress might not be quite what you want. Though at that time, we were trying to mostly focus with Congress on the Affordable Care Act, and it was a same party system. So anyway, the challenge was, how do you build a system that brings about this change? How do you get the leadership of agencies? How do you get them to actually pay attention? So what we did was we said in the budget, all of you need to identify a small number between 5 and 8, 3 to 8, it can be 2 to 9, but just a small number of goals where you're going to focus. And so every cabinet member has done that. So if you go to clear goals, you'll see again, using goals to improve performance and accountability, focused on outcomes, stretch targets for these priority goals. You have the other goals that can go in your strategic plans that are longer term, which can include the call for legislation. In your annual plans, which can cover everything. Some of those goals can be stretch. Others may be steady improvement. Others may be steady state. So think about that. We want you to measure and analyze to find what works. I'll give you an illustration of that in a second. And then we want you to deliver better results using data-driven reviews. And chief operating officers, the number 2, what's called the deputy secretary at every agency, you have to run those reviews on your priority goals at least once a quarter. So if you click onto the Clear Goals button, you'll actually find all these the goals the agencies set, the full list. We only focused first on 24 agencies, the 16 cabinet agencies and 8 other large agencies like Social Security, which, by the way, does have an electronic filing target, and you can take a look at all of that if you want to. I will also say, Patrick, the IRS has an electronic filing target. And we were trying to make it so you could sort the goals. You can sort them by various budget themes and actually find all the contributing different kinds of goals. There are strategic goals and objectives. There are agency priority goals. And then there are these cross-agency priority goals. So you can look and see which ones contribute to energy, which ones contribute to other kinds of budget issues, and you can also sort by agency. So as you see here, I'm scrolling down. You start with the 14 cross-agency priority goals. Here again, we have a goal leader to manage across the agencies on things like the president's goal. I love that you've got broadband here. The president's goal of doubling exports by the end of 2014, energy efficiency improving by 50%. I think it was by 2020. He's since upped that. And they have it in the last quarter, so it hasn't been updated here. But you know, broadband, 98% coverage at 4 gigs. So, and then you have agency priority goals. So let me take you to the Department of Interior's goal and give you a sense of what we were trying to do here and how we did it. Notice here Mike Poole. Mike Poole is the goal leader. The agency head, the cabinet secretary or the deputy secretary, had to name a goal leader. Mike is the one accountable for what's going on here. So there is a goal page for every one of there are 117 priority goals, and every one of them has something like this. The cross-agency priority goals aren't quite like this. They're a PDF because we have to figure out how to make that work. But for every goal, Gary Banks yesterday talked about the what and the how of what we do. We actually tried to add the why and the who. So why did you choose this goal? Why is it important? That's what's in the goal overview. How are you going to try and make progress on this goal? That's what the strategies discussion is. Every goal leader needs to write this. They have the option to put little learn more buttons in here, to tell more if they wanted to. Now, in this case, this is a goal. The president has said that renewable energy, much better renewable energy capacity in the country is very important. It lessens your dependency on oil. It can also save money in the long run. It's much better for your economic growth. So the Department of the Interior set a goal by the end of 2011. The first set of priority goals were set with the second budget of the president. So fiscal year 11 budget, which would have gone in February 2010. And the fiscal year 2011, by the end of September 2011, the Department of the Interior set a goal that it was going to get 9,000 megawatts of renewable energy permitted on interior land. Not built, but get through the permitting process and then let the private sector do the building. And basically, the question is that a stretch target? Well, in the prior 20 years, the Department of Energy had basically had 1,500 megawatts of renewable energy permitted on interior land. That's it, the total. And they were going to try and get 9,000 megawatts done in 2 years because it was a priority. And this is, with this goals and measurement stuff, It's really, what the goals are, that's the political question. That's the political debate. That gets decided by the elected officials. And in this case, their appointees. But then the delivery on it, the how, the what, the why, you know, especially the how and the what, that's part of the execution we were trying to work on. And that can be very much influenced by the way you manage. We said outcome-focused stretch targets. We're not telling you what they should be. That would be a conversation that actually took place not with my office, but with the budget offices on behalf of the president and with the policy councils about what they would focus on. But we want you to explain why you think that's an important focus and how you're going to make progress on it. And then BLM, the Interior Department, decided that they were going to give you more details. So this is a much more detailed description of the approach they're taking to renewable energy. And oh, by the way, you can also see progress on each of the different applications that have come in so that the applicants and the community knows what's going on and what's happening. And you can go even deeper to see what's already been approved. So going back here to this goal homepage, again, this was the overview. Why is this important and how are you going to do it? And then we wanted Mike Poole, the manager here, to think about, okay, how well am I doing? So the Progress and Next Steps tab basically is Mike's reflection on how did I do over the last quarter? How have I done over the period that I've been trying to make progress? So our objective was to make sure Mike was thinking about this and managing to it, because I couldn't go and check up on every deputy secretary. These are pretty powerful people, and that's 24, that's an awful lot of checking, and it's not going to build the best relations. I'm trying to build a tool that helps them manage. So the progress update is, what did you get accomplished in the last quarter, and what did you get accomplished since the goal has been set? The next steps is, what are you going to try and get done in this quarter and the next quarter? And the future actions are, what are you going to try to get done for the remainder of the goal period? So in some cases, you have actual milestones, like we're going to issue a request for proposals. We're going to try and start construction on this particular project. In other cases, such as this one, we're going to keep moving forward with applications and show you where we are on all of those. And then we said, we want you to report your performance. Now, not everything is easily measurable, and we want to work with agencies to figure out what they can measure and what kind of measurement is useful. So we said, you need to have performance indicators, which is right there, performance indicator, but you can also have other indicators. So if you want to have productivity indicators, you can have those under a category called other indicators. We did not limit the story that the agencies could tell. We also urged them, if they want to do precursor indicators that give you warning signs or unwanted side effects. So for example, in policing, you might want to make sure you're bringing when you're trying to bring the crime rate down, your complaints against the police are not going up. So this is a way of explaining this, and actually you can show the metadata. We created a place where agencies are to provide the metadata explanations to the public. This is what the data is. Then you can also go to the data explanations on the data. So you see here, there's more detail provided. These are the actual target values, and then the actual values, and then details provided each quarter explaining how they did. So we're trying to get the manager to think about this, but also to figure out how to communicate it. This is our accountability mechanism. And now let's go back and look here. Remember I said the goal here was 9,000 by the end of September 2011? Well, look at how much progress they made. They only made 6,054 megawatts. Is that a problem? Should we beat them up because they didn't meet their target? So we decided not to beat them up, because look at that curve. I mean, really. You know, they clearly didn't know how to do it. They'd never done it before. They had to learn how to do it. They had to learn how to do environmental impact statements. If you look at the goal statement, it very clearly puts the environment in the goal statement. And then they started to figure it out. So that by September 2011, they started to make progress. They hadn't met their target, but what this allowed me to start to tell people, this is not about meeting targets. The goal here is not to meet a target. The goal here is to make dramatic progress. So we don't want to start rating people on whether or not they meet targets, because if you do that, what's going to happen? Going to pick timid targets, right? You got risk of measurement manipulation, so then you have to think about, okay, should we put a validation, a monitoring system on the measurement itself so that you've added costs to it? In some cases, that may be worthwhile. But in other cases, maybe it's enough just to make this public and provide details so the public can see if you're telling the truth or not. And give you, by the way, there's a feedback button here, right here, that, you know, if you're not telling the truth, someone can say, I don't agree with this, and you've got the data. I don't understand it. I do understand it. Now look here, they've made 12,573 megawatts. The goal was to hit 11,000 megawatts by the end of fiscal year 2013, which is September 30th, 2013. They beat it. It's June 30th, 2013, and they're at 12,573. And guess what? The president has sort of said to them, that was great. He's talked about it in his State of the Union. He's talked about it in his climate change address. And he said, and I want you guys to go beyond that and really get a much more aggressive target. So when they set their target, the next set of targets for 15, in the February budget that gets released for the president's budget, they will, at the same time, update their targets. And I'm sure it will reflect what the president said. So we realize we're encouraging agencies to recognize that you need to manage across programs. So we have a tab here for contributing programs. So this is the way we're trying to manage. I'll show you another thing, which is, and we're trying to get everyone more aware. We're using the website to try and build awareness as a learning tool across government with our delivery partners at the state and local level. And then here, there are other goals here that are the priority goals of the department, including things like the reducing violent crime in Indian country. Well, this is an interesting goal. If you read it, you basically see that they're trying to reduce the crime on 4 reservations. They tried to do that by end of 2011. They're now at 6 reservations. That's not a whole lot of reservations when there are hundreds of reservations. How can you say this is an ambitious goal? How can you say this is an ambitious goal? Well, it's an ambitious goal because they didn't even know how to reduce the crime. But now they figured out how to reduce the crime by basically working with 4 reservations very carefully. The first thing they did was they brought them in to teach them how to measure. They then started to have weekly phone calls, data-driven reviews. They built a data system to support this. So it is using the data and the goals to inspire, to focus, to energize, to engage, to enlist the community. It's not using it in a gotcha way. So a lot of what we did was to get people off the mindset of it's getting a good grade from the Office of Management and Budget. It's not about percentage of targets met. It's about percentage of key indicators where performance is trending in the right direction. We want you focusing on that. We do expect you to try and meet those stretch targets. 80% of them, we said. We'll say 75. We didn't give a hard number. We just said, if you're meeting all of your targets, OMB will be asking you if you're setting ambitious enough targets, because we want the power of a stretch target to inspire folks. And at the same time, we use that line in our guidance. We're going to look at you, if you're meeting all your targets, to send a clear message back to what Bill Bratton, the New York City Police Chief, said, which is nobody got in trouble if the crime rate went up. They got in trouble if if they didn't know why it had gone up and didn't have a plan to deal with it. So sometimes stuff happens beyond you. So we were trying to get the accountability system, the accountability expectations into a mode of continuous improvement with breakthrough improvement in some areas and steady state improvement in other areas. Not a gotcha system, but a learning system. And that also meant making sure that our incentive structure didn't get, move too much, didn't create unwanted discouragement, so that if you basically say, okay, link the senior executive services pay to meeting the targets, they're going to negotiate simple targets. That's a lesson we learned from New Zealand. They went to output targets. We want you to focus on outcomes because that's what we're trying to influence as the government. And so that actually allowed us, by saying, look, we want you to be accountable for managing, for mastery of the measurement, for staying on top of the data, for setting really good goals and managing them. That's what we were trying to do. So I would say things we've learned that we put this in place, it's worked. Progress is being made. I can tell you progress across the board on those 120 or so goals. You can also look to the agency and see the featured report tells you the full performance report elsewhere. I think we have a lot to learn about how we build genuine learning systems, how we integrate evidence, the experiments that the Nudge team was telling you about, but other kinds of ongoing analysis, better ways of doing analysis, and better ways of communicating the data to the variety of folks out there, including the delivery partners, who can help you, who are part of solving the problem. So it was some of the conversation yesterday that Gary and Peter were having. It is a way of using these management tools, these power tools, goals and measurement. It's a way of using them to enlist and engage. And it's a way of getting agile adjustments, because you're making sure people are looking on a frequent basis and they can adjust their actions, they can adjust their next steps. It's a way of continuous improvement, engaging the full body of folks who can help you on that improvement. So obviously there's a lot more I can say. I want to leave time for questions. So thank you all both for sharing with me what you've all learned. I've learned a ton over the last day and a half. And thank you for your interest.
You mentioned, Shelley, about the Prime Minister's delivery unit, which was in the Cabinet Office. But in recent years, there's been a very violent reaction against that. And not only has the unit been disbanded, but the new ministers coming in use this kind of, in a negative way, the phrase of deliveryology as almost like a totem of what had gone wrong with public administration, particularly that sense of the centre of government pulling levers that down a delivery chain that increasingly weren't attached to the reality of public service improvement on the ground. I wondered if you thought about the lessons learned from the experience of the delivery unit in the UK in the sort of negative way as well as the positive.
Yeah, so two things I'd say on that. First of all, I made a conscious decision not to name what we were doing, which in the short term probably hurt me politically, because I couldn't talk about my delivery unit, I couldn't talk about the stat system. We had agencies like the Housing and Urban Development and our Federal Emergency Management who decided to set up stat system, but the Food and Drug Administration set up a track system. We chose not to name it because I didn't want, if we only had 4 years or even with 8 years, I didn't want somebody to come in and feel the need to say we're doing something different. I wanted to build the infrastructure, the plumbing that makes a really dynamic, healthy organization. So we didn't name it, and that was partly watching some of this other stuff happen. I think the second thing is we were trying to build, my office had 4 people. And I actually had hoped to get a team of 30 people in the Office of Management and Budget, but that wasn't going to work. We did get legislation passed that made permanent what we were doing. Fortunately, after we figured it out enough, and in that legislation, it called for a Performance Improvement Council, and we are trying to build capacity in our General Services Administration to support that, and using that as a way to get the agencies to see value so they want to keep it alive.
Patrick, have you got a comment on the delivery unit?
Yeah, I mean, the delivery unit was innovative in its day, and most of these things, work for a little while. They don't work forever, and usually they have a kind of shelf life. I think what's very important is always that, you should look at the mix of activities that you're doing and be sure that the mix of activities that you've got is the right one. So, for example, I don't see a problem of an EPA trying to monitor a river and they don't have any statistics about the water quality. That doesn't seem to me to be, an outcome thing. That seems to me like a defective set of activities. You can't monitor a river, or you certainly can't improve a river unless you have decent water quality management. That's not focusing on outcomes. That's just doing the job. And many of the cases that Shelley outlines, I think, are doing the job kind of things. They're not really focusing on outcomes. Now, it's incredibly difficult to run a huge thing like the Federal Civil Service, and there's tremendous improvements in all of the ways that Shelley's outlined. But I think it's really kind of important to, not overly outcome orientate things. If the real problem is you've got a defective activity list, fix the activity list. Do things that you need to do. And similarly, we've got problems with federal regulators in many areas of workplace safety. We have plants blowing up all over the USA because people are not visiting, inspectors are not coming back. You need to, I think, really focus a lot on the minutiae of what should the organization be doing given its mission and so on. You can't improve water quality if you don't have any measurement of water quality, that's for sure, but that's not an outcome measurement. That's an activity thing.
So I want to add to the first question, and then if you guys want to, we can get into this outcomes debate. When I look at the National Fire Protection Association, the firefighting stuff, when I look at traffic safety, and the management and measurement system that's been in place there, and it's actually almost international. And when I look at things like the Coast Guard on oil spills, these are systems that were put in place that are very clear about the objectives. They provide data that people across the organization can use all the time. The Charles River thing is still going. It's 3 presidents and 4 regional administrators later. When you build these systems that work this way, and then I think they can last on their own because people see their value.
But there is a tension, isn't there, in the focus, keeping the focus on them versus...
Well, if we go into this outcomes things, the Clean Water Act is written, it says you've got to have this water quality, and people were measuring once every 5 years. It's a change of a mindset.
Well, that's a hopeless way to measure, You had an agency doing a hopeless job. That's all you had.
Well, but it's the same. Let's take the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. You have basically I think 1 inspector per 80,000 regulated facilities.
So
you've got to start to get the data about the accidents, the incidents, get it out there.
So you need a more risk-based, computer-based, digitally based set of systems.
With total agreement.
Don't you love it when there's a convergence? John Warner has the last question.
Is it's very public, very transparent, and it's principally based on naming and shaming. Is that the way you intended to work?
Absolutely not. It was no intention of doing naming and shaming. It's really not the shaming. We are trying to get a continuous improvement and to build a system that could help people see it's not about gotcha, it's about improvement. And we don't expect you to make progress all the time. We're giving you an opportunity to explain where you haven't. But if you can't explain it, then you ought to be shamed. But that was not the intention. And in fact, I'm not sure that's a valid, I think we need to do, and this I'll say to the academics in the room, to work with government folks, to really push this theory of transparency. Because I think we need to figure out when and how it works and how to provide data that will be an incentive for improvement. But we leaned completely the opposite from name and shame. I was trying to, the grades that the prior administration had done, and I don't think it was done intentionally, but it was to embarrass the departments with bad grades, right? And all you did was you taught the departments how to get good grades. It didn't necessarily improve performance. And so we were really trying to get people focused on continuous improvement with breakthrough improvement in their priority areas.